We're going to continue with the Cold War today. I want to talk about McCarthyism, or the Second Red Scare. You'll recall there was a Red Scare after the First World War. This one is going to last much longer, and it is going to be of much more severe consequences. Definition of McCarthyism really is just a policy of hunting out communists that are supposed to be working in our government. And Joe McCarthy is the primary exponent of this. Richard Nixon would get his start as a red baiter here in the 1940s, along with McCarthy. Let's talk about context for a moment, because this anti-communist hysteria that McCarthy provokes is difficult to understand unless you can put it in historical context. At the end of the Second World War, the Red Army occupied Eastern Europe. Now, this was a disappointment to the American people who believed that they were fighting for freedom and liberty for all people. Of course, there was nothing we could do about this unless you wanted to go to war with Russia. You simply had to accept this fact. Perhaps our political leadership could have better prepared the American people for this inevitability. A second thing, a series of events that take place both in Europe and in Asia are going to baffle and disappoint the American people. Senator McCarthy will use these events to fan the flames of anti-communist hysteria. Now, in the late 40s, Stalin decided to put the squeeze on the Western Alliance at its weakest point, which of course is West Berlin. You'll remember that Germany is divided as a result of the Cold War. Berlin itself is divided as a result of the Cold War. East Berlin under the domination of the Soviets, West Berlin allied with the Western powers. Stalin allowed the Western powers access to West Berlin deep in the Soviet zone. Let's face it, West Berlin is the most vulnerable point in the NATO alliance because it is completely surrounded by the Red Army and could be shut down within an hour if Stalin so desired. So in the late 40s, Stalin decided to put the squeeze on us here, and he began to prohibit traffic in and out of Berlin, West Berlin. The United States responded with what's called the Berlin airlift, and you can see images of this on the film. The United States Air Force literally supplied West Berlin for nearly a year with fuel and food and water and medicine and on and on. After some months, this became not an embarrassment for the West, it became an embarrassment for Stalin, who was unable to prevent this airlift without going to war, which he did not want to do. So his squeeze on West Berlin was called off after almost a year's duration. This, of course, was very disappointing to the American people. Our World War II ally, the Soviets, are now behaving as an enemy instead of a friend. A second event that's going to help trigger this anti-communist hysteria is the first test of a Soviet A-bomb. President Truman was informed in 1945 that it would take the Russians at least 10 years to construct an atomic weapon. So presumably for about a decade, the United States would have this window of opportunity, the only superpower with atomic weapons. Well, the Soviets exploded their first atomic weapon in 1949. What is that, about 6 years too soon? This was very disappointing to the American people and to the leadership. The Soviets had caught up quickly, and McCarthy helped ask the question, or inflame the question, how were they able to do this? How were the Soviets able to construct an atomic weapon so quickly and so much ahead of schedule? It became commonplace to believe that the only way the Russians could have done this was through atomic spies, that our government must be riddled with spies who are passing technical secrets along to the Soviets so that they can build a weapon as well. In rapid succession after the Soviet A-bomb is tested, the Chinese Civil War comes to an end and the communists win. Mao Zedong declares Red China in 1949. And our Chinese ally throughout the Second World War is now our Chinese enemy, a communist enemy. Within 6 months of China going communist, North Korea, a client communist state of the Chinese, attacks South Korea, a state supported by the West. This is viewed as an aggressive attempt by monolithic communism to expand its borders. It's believed that North Korea would not make such a move without the approval of both Mao Zedong in China and Joseph Stalin in Russia. So containment now, that's central tenet of the Truman Doctrine, comes into play. The United States organizes resistance to the North Korean invasion of South Korea, and we get involved here for about 3 years in a very bloody war on the Korean Peninsula. Again, containment in action. So you have these series of events: the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, the Soviet atomic weapon being tested in our eyes much too soon, China going communist, and now North Korea attacking South Korea. Senator McCarthy was able to use these events to whip up an anti-communist hysteria in the United States. A few words about McCarthy. He was a junior senator, Republican senator from Wisconsin. He had fought in the Pacific during the war. In the late 40s, he's looking for a campaign issue with which to attract voters. I believe he's out drinking one night with his buddies, and somebody suggests the anti-communism as an issue, that it seemed to be catching hold in the country. And Senator McCarthy decided to try this. Legend has it he was making a speech, I think at a Republican ladies club or something in Wheeling, West Virginia. And at the end of the speech, he announced that he had the names of 52 known communists still working in the United States government. This accusation created headlines the next day. And a headline for Joe McCarthy was like a drink. You know, the effects wear off and you have to have another. He continued to make speeches of this sort, and at the end of these speeches, he would have a list of 172 communists or 58 communists. The numbers would always change because he was simply making them up. He didn't have any communists at all that he knew of. But he was getting publicity and he was getting headlines by making these accusations. McCarthy's attempts to whip up this anti-communist hysteria were, of course, aided by what already existed in the House, and that was the House Un-American Activities Committee. McCarthy improved upon this by subpoenaing witnesses to come before the Senate committee, and people accused of being affiliated in some way with leftist causes were grilled. Many careers were ruined. A blacklist was created in Hollywood whereby actors, screenwriters, directors, musicians, people who were in any way tainted with the communist brush lost their jobs, could not work openly in the country. McCarthy had an even greater damage or a greater negative impact on U.S. history by attacking those experts in the United States government that were familiar with the Far East. Now, you'll recall Mao Zedong is victorious and Red China is established in 1949. North Korea with the attack on South Korea in 1950. McCarthy looks to our foreign service officers in the State Department who work in the Far East, and he blames them for these events, as if China cannot conduct her affairs herself, as if she needs help from United States spies or traitors. However ludicrous this line of thought appears to us today, many people bought it hook, line, and sinker in the 1950s, that it had to be U.S. traitors, U.S. spies, U.S. foreign service officers are somehow complicit in the rapid change of our strategic situation. Again, our Soviet ally is now our Soviet enemy. Why? Our Chinese ally is now our Chinese enemy. Why? Communism is on the move. It's overrun Eastern and Central Europe. The North Koreans are on the move. There's a communist insurgency in Vietnam. So there's a great deal of fear here that communism is going to be very competitive with the democratic system and with the market economy. So McCarthy would bring people in front of his committee. He would bully them. He was a drunk. You can tell he's about half soused by watching films of him. You get the feeling he has a flask in his jacket, his coat pocket. He would talk over people if they said things that he did not like. He would gavel them into silence. He used a tactic called the big lie. I think Hitler said one time that the bigger the lie, the more people will believe it. And indeed, McCarthy practiced this. He would simply make outlandish accusations. No one would challenge him in that particular moment, and he would continue. The less he's challenged, the more the bully he became, and he would continue to make outlandish accusations. He also would use another tactic. How should we term it? I guess guilt by association. He would bring people before the committee and ask them if their first wife's cousin's next door neighbor was once involved in a communist or a leftist organization. And the witness would be baffled and try to remember these details. And it didn't matter whether it was factual or not. It was of no importance. What was important was that the witness had been smeared or tainted with an anti-communist brush. So bullying, speaking over witnesses, gaveling them into silence, making broad and false accusations, these are the type of tactics that McCarthy used. Finally, in 1954, McCarthy would take on the United States Army. And this is significant because this, for the first time, the American people were able to actually see McCarthy on television. TVs were still relatively uncommon in the early 50s. So people would gather at the bar or the drugstore or where have you, and they would watch what was called the Army McCarthy hearings. And for the first time, the American people actually got a look at this bully, this drunk, Joe McCarthy. And they didn't like what they saw. They watched his tactics. They did not like them. They did not think he was fair. And the Army McCarthy hearings represent both the apex and the end of McCarthy's influence. He bit off more than he could chew, quite frankly, and he ran up against a lawyer, a Mr. Welch, who was the Army's attorney, who was not afraid of doing what you should do to bullies, and that's punch them right in the nose. Welch challenged Joe McCarthy. At the end of one session, I believe Mr. Welch said something to the effect that, to McCarthy, "Have you no sense of decency after all this time? Have you no sense of decency?" This was headlines across the country the next day. And McCarthy's power, you could almost envision him as a giant balloon that has suddenly been pricked and all the air goes out of it. McCarthy's power begins to evaporate very quickly after this confrontation with the Army. And within 3 years, I believe, Joe McCarthy's dead of alcohol poisoning. He's censored by the United States Senate, which is the most severe criticism or most severe measure that the Senate can take against one of its own. And once his power evaporated and once he had been humiliated publicly, Joe simply took to the bottle and drank himself to death and would indeed be dead by age 49, I believe, in 1957. One last thing on McCarthy, and this is probably the most significant thing. McCarthy has made Democratic politicians very fearful of being accused of being soft on communism. Our Far Eastern experts were stripped, run out of the Foreign Service. This left us sort of blind and naked in the Far East. Of course, we would soon become involved in Vietnam, where we needed experts, people who spoke the language and knew the culture. McCarthy stripped us of these assets and made Presidents Kennedy and Johnson, Democrats, more aggressive in their policies than they might otherwise have been because of the fear of being accused of being soft on communism. So that's a quick look at Joe McCarthy. We'll look at Vietnam next time. Thank you.